I mean, just to ask a brutally honest question, the thing that comes out in your book when you talk about education is this sort of huge passion about the subject, and the thing I'm often struck by, I was in Liberia a couple of weeks ago in West Point, which is the slum down by the sea, and you talk to mothers about education, and they bridle with this unbelievable ambition in the face of the most impossible odds, and they've got this idea that I'm going to get my kid through school come what may, and this is going to transform their lives. And I used to work for the UN, and I would often be struck in UN meetings on education how that they could be deeply soporific affairs, that that they don't exactly you would never come out of these meetings energized, that, and I mean just as someone who understands politics and the interface between these international processes, I mean, how do we build the energy and the coalitions that we need to make this SDG goal achievable?
That's a very good question, and I wish I had the complete answer. I think there's a degree of pitch and messaging to different constituencies that sometimes we don't get right. One of the things about the global education community, having stepped into it post being in politics, is it's full of incredibly intelligent people with very worthy ideas, and we love an in-detail technical conversation. We just love it. And it does strike me as I participate in a number of those conversations, and I'm enough of a nerd to enjoy them, so I'm not saying it's a problem for me, but it does worry me that if you actually had a global decision maker step into the room, if President Obama has found a spare 5 minutes, or Chancellor Merkel somehow materialised on the doorstep, or the President of China or whoever, that if they just came and sat and listened for a few minutes, they would walk out wondering what language we are speaking, because so much of the global education conversation is full of buzzwords and acronyms and concepts we've invested a lot of intellectual property in developing, but they're not very accessible. And so I think we've got to segment the conversation a bit. And for global leaders, the pitch to them, I think, is, as you put it, if we're going to be serious about any of these sustainable development goals, then we've got to get the education piece right. And of the things that they most worry about, we won't actually see progress in combating poverty, that the need for the world to be stepping forward with development will be never-ending, as opposed to getting us to a new sustainable, global norm. That's going to be a persistent worry for them unless we step up on education. Of the things that people worry about in national security, whilst education is not the complete answer, Osama bin Laden was an educated man. There's plenty of data to show that the more capabilities, opportunities people have, the less, the siren song of radicalisation actually attracts them. So for global leaders, combating poverty, a stronger global economy, a better global security situation, education's the key. I think we've got to pitch the argument there. And for the community in general to be energised, I think we've got to make it accessible for them. One of the sort of word pictures that I think helps people understand the journey we're on, I mean, at current rate of progress, it will be 100 years before we see a cohort of girls in sub-Saharan Africa who get to go to a full cycle of schooling. 100 years. I did a little mental calculation. I've got my great-nephew Ethan, he's just under 2. Kissed him goodbye on Saturday night before I got on the plane to come here. It will be, if he has children at the average age for an Australian male, and they do in turn, his great-grandchildren will be alive when that first cohort gets educated. My great-nephew's great-grandchildren. and I'm not 100, I'm 54. So, you know, these word pictures, I think, help make it real for people that projection of the future is such a deeply unsatisfactory one that we've got to do everything to shorten that time horizon. I mean, I'd certainly like to live to see it, and I'm not going to make it 100 years from now.
Well, I think there's a great a lesson right there in how to frame a statistic in a compelling way that we can all learn from. One of the things that you focused on a lot at home in the education debate was bringing the business, or persuading the business community that this matters for Australia's competitive position, for their skills recruitment, and then you brought them in specifically. I think the person you had chairing, I can't remember their name now, but
David Gonski, yes.
Yeah, who chaired the commission to look at equitable funding or social needs across schools. And I guess many people would say that in education globally, unlike in health, we haven't somehow managed to really engage the business community in a meaningful way.
Yes.
How do you think we change that picture?
I agree with that conclusion that we haven't engaged the business community in a meaningful way, and I think one thing we can learn from health, I mean, health and education, very different. You know, if we compare ourselves with the global movement to vaccinate children, you know, inherently a global good, identical chemical formula. What we put in the arm of a child in Australia and what we put in the arm of a child in Rwanda has to be the same thing. Education, different, sensitive to culture, to context, locally delivered service. But I think that there are parts of what we need to do to build our capabilities in education where we can learn lessons from health about how they conceptualise global goods and how they involve the business community in the development of the global supply chains for those goods. And what do I mean by that? Things like books, which are so short, true deployment of new technology, not the dropping in a kind of random fashion of hardware and software that doesn't then fit with the education model that's being used, but the deployment of technology that is integrated with the education model. The deployment of teacher professional supports of learning materials that they can use in classrooms, professional development modules. Many of these things could be susceptible to development in global platforms and more sophisticated modes of supply. And I think we can have a healthy conversation with the business community about that. Now, I'm certainly well aware that the involvement of the business community in education can be a very controversial topic. I mean, I come from a nation where we don't have any for-profit education provision. In fact, it's expressly illegal in parts of Australia. It's ruled out by legislation to be a for-profit company that runs a school. But we've got a very vibrant non-government schooling system, and you know, a vibrant dialogue with the business community helped me when I was Minister for Education. So I think there are ways of capturing that energy without distorting us from the big goals we have about universality and access and inclusion and equity.
Yeah. So on the equity question, and as I mentioned, that one of the, I think, very distinctive things that you did in Australia was that you changed a long-standing funding formula whereby federal government funding started to try to, in some ways, mitigate the disadvantage that kids would bring into schools with them. But it's interesting, I always find in the international discussions on education, is that almost nobody raises that issue for poor countries. You know, the World Bank tends not to raise it, UN agencies don't really talk about it. And most governments in developing countries that don't, in the overwhelming majority of cases, they don't have equitable funding formulas. And as you know from your experience as education minister, it's a tough thing to raise. I mean, I think in Australia there were distinctive things about the church-based schools and so on, but I guess in every country, the question of how do you allocate resources to the most disadvantaged parts of the community. And I guess it's very easy for us all, and for governments and others, to pitch up in the UN and talk about no one being left behind. it's another thing to say we're actually going to allocate more resources to those who are being left furthest behind. So I guess the question is just as a practical political leader, if you were trying to address that issue head on, whether it's in GPE or in the wider international engagement, how would you set about broaching it?
I think the starting point needs to be transparency about financial flows now, and we don't have that. And we've got to remember that, $39 billion figure has been generated assuming quite large increases in domestic education expenditure by developing countries. So it seems to me there's a few pieces we can put together and hopefully get a good synergy around. We do need more transparency about total education budgets and about how they are then deployed. For the quality conversation, we do need more transparency about how children are performing in school. And I know there's plenty of debate about what can we measure, what should we measure, but it seems to me, the obvious starting place is to be measuring literacy and numeracy and then broadening our capabilities on measurement over time. And then getting more sophisticated measures of disadvantage. I mean, whilst what GPE does is work very strongly with the lowest income countries in the world, we've got to remember that we're not going to solve the education equity issue unless we're addressing at-risk populations in a number of middle-income countries because they actually explain large numbers of the children who are out of school. So if we can bring this together, at the school level where we can get transparency about how kids are achieving in literacy and numeracy, the characteristics, the socio-economic characteristics of the kids in the school, and the financing that's going into the school. If you can get transparency about those things, I actually think the political conversation will fix itself because I'm enough of an optimist that if you make express manifest unfairness, and it is absolutely clear to everyone, domestic governments, voters, donors, everybody, that the most advantaged kids are getting the biggest share of the resources, people will step in with a campaign to render that politically unviable for the longer term and to demand the reorientation based on need. It's when you don't have that data and everything's opaque that it gets harder and harder to have the conversation. So I think building those tools and capabilities is really important. And whilst GPE working in the low income countries, even in a number of low income countries, there's a high degree of differentiation in the population. And by the time we're talking about the out of school population in some middle income countries, it is their disadvantage that is keeping them behind the things that are propelling the rest of the children forward.